Om Sahana Vavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Sahaviryam Karavavai Tejasvinavati Jamastu Mavid Vishabhai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. May Brahman protect us, may he guide us and give us strength and right understanding. May love and harmony be with us all. Om peace, peace, peace. And good evening. We are reading from the complete works of Swami Ramakrishnananda, one of the 16 disciples of Sri Ramakrishna, who did much of his work in the south. He began the centers down in the southern part of India. And we are in the middle of a chapter called Morality as a Factor in the Progress of Humanity. Now, we apologize for not broadcasting last week. We had some technical difficulties and staff shortages, you could say. Maybe that's not a technical difficulty, it's more of a staff shortage. So we are going back to pretty much where we left off 2 weeks ago. And if you're following along, it's on page 324 in volume 3, in the middle of that page, where it says eating, sleeping, and uniting. So that's where we're going to start, and Atma's going to read for us.
Eating, sleeping, uniting with one another in love and fear, these things we have in common with beasts. Are we therefore in any way better than they? When such questions rise, man begins to hate his animal life. He feels he has descended to the lowest level of abject animal life. Now he wants to spurn that life and intensely desires to ascend to a higher godly life and morality. Morality supplies him with the necessary ladder to effect this purpose. By means of the ladder of morality alone can a man expect to get rid of his brutish life and get back his higher or godly life. And what is morality? Morality is an incessant struggle for independence. We've already seen how the mind of a man has become a slave to his senses and to his passions and appetites. Blinded by an intense desire for sensual enjoyment, he cannot have any idea of his abject condition, and so what is really painful appears to him to be the source of all bliss. As long as this appetite for sensual enjoyment lingers in him, he will never be able to strike off this illusion. He will have to labor under this hypochondriasis, thinking this mortal life to be immortal, taking a foe to be his friend, and a friend to be his foe. But when he does not like to be classified with animals, when his good nature tries to assert itself in him, when senses appear to him to not be his friends, but his enemies, when he considers that no sensual pleasure, however intense, can in reality be called a pleasure, but rather pain in the form of pleasure, and therefore much more harmful and painful than real pain. And when pleasure appears to him to be like a pill of quinine, thinly coated over with sugar, he is then no more a hypochondriac, but sees things in their proper light. The light of morality then begins to shine and light the path leading towards the truth. He then clearly understands the meaning of Bhagavan Sri Krishna's priceless words when that great teacher instructed his friend and disciple Arjuna in this way.
All right, before we read that, I'll just make a couple of comments. You know, at first glance, you begin to wonder what he's talking about when he says that morality is going to give him independence, because often we think of the rules of morality as being very restrictive. But then, of course, he explains that the idea is that we're trying to get free from our senses. We don't want our senses to control us. We want to be able to control the senses. So it's freedom from the slavery of the senses, and that's what he was talking about in earlier paragraphs here. That is the problem. And so we need to have some sort of guidelines on how to live our life so that we're not just completely slaves to our sense organs. And so, as he points out, we often take our foe to be a friend and a friend to be a foe. And we were talking about earlier how the sort of extreme example of the difficulty with our sense organs is addictions. Addictions are substances or activities which we think are going to make us feel good and happy, but they end up making us miserable because they force you to want more and more and more, to the point where you end up being sick. So, whether it's some sort of addictive substance or activity, the more you consume that particular substance, the worse off you get, because your body craves more and more of it to get even close to the same effect. And so the pleasurable aspect of it gets dimmer and dimmer, and the destructive aspects get greater and greater. And so the other kinds of sensual pleasures are not quite as that extreme, but we can understand the problem from looking at the extreme. And just things like dieting. We all know how difficult dieting can be, and we know what things taste good. We know all sorts of sweets and desserts and fast foods and so forth. They're all designed to make us want to eat more of them. And unfortunately, they're not the healthiest part of our diet. And so you have to learn to want health more than the sense pleasure of eating something that tastes good. And so this is just part of the normal process. All right, so now let's read what Sri Krishna says to Arjuna.
O son of Kunti, know that all contact-born enjoyments are the sources of our misery, inasmuch as they have a beginning as well as an end. The sage, therefore, finds no pleasure in them. The mind naturally desires to enjoy any pleasure permanently. If it likes anything, it hates the sudden break in the course of a certain enjoyment. But no such permanent enjoyment is to be found here, for all sensual pleasures must have a beginning after pain, and an end when they end. The very ceasing of it becomes painful. There is no pleasure here which neither follows nor is followed by pain. All sensual pleasures have pain in the beginning and pain in the end, are followed by pain and dissolve in pain, and how can such a pleasure be called a pleasure at all? It is pain for the garb of pleasure.
And of course, also this idea of having something give you some sort of permanent pleasure, when you think about it, it's really ridiculous, because if you had the same thing that you find pleasurable over and over and over and over and over again, you'd be so bored, you'd be screaming. Even if it's your favorite piece of music, if you had to listen to it nonstop day and night, well, you would just go crazy. You couldn't stand it. So all of these things really can't possibly give us permanent pleasure, and you just have to realize that. Part of the game is simply to realize, all right, it's fun for now, but it's not going to be fun forever, and I'm not going to get attached to it. So it's being able to detach yourself from things that's the important thing. It doesn't mean you can't ever enjoy anything. That isn't going to be the recommendation, but you have to be able to realize that these things are not going to give you permanent pleasure, and so you can detach yourself from it and just observe how your mind works with it. Oh yeah, okay, that was kind of fun as I enjoyed it, but not going to get attached to it. It's like video games. A lot of kids get addicted to video games, and pretty soon they're spending more time on the video games than they are in school. And what is going to be the permanent happiness of learning how to play video games compared to getting a good education? So that kind of thing, we just have to realize fairly soon on that you have to be somewhat regulated. Now, of course, morality gets into a very sticky point, because if you look at the moral rules of different cultures, they're not always the same. And so there's kind of a relativeness to this, both temporal and spatial differences in what people think is moral and what they think is immoral. But the basic bottom line is going to be, for our purposes, what leads you closer to God and what takes you further away, what makes you remember your divine nature and what makes you forget your divine nature, what leads to long-term unhappiness or disabilities or pain, and what leads to everlasting bliss. All right, let's continue with what Swami Ramakrishnananda says here.
For him who reasons in this way, the world loses all its charms. At that time, he does not like to be satisfied with false pleasures. He then searches after perennial bliss, a bliss which will last to eternity. And this he does not find in the world outside, neither in his senses, and therefore tries to find it out somewhere else, beyond the senses. His first struggle, therefore, consists in waging an incessant war with the senses, for these latter will not easily let loose their slave who has been so obediently serving them all the while. The senses, therefore, always try to rob his mind from him, and he, on the other hand, tries to disentangle the mind from their clutches and wean it away to his side. In this struggle for mental independence, morality should be made the commander-in-chief, and all higher aspirations and nobler aims should be arrayed as soldiers to fight down the senses. The man must be strong and courageous, persevering, and assiduous enough to continue the fight to the last, with the hope of a sure victory over the senses. If he be weak and cowardly, there can be no hope of victory. He's sure to fall a prey to his senses.
And of course, another comment, on differences in morality. You know, sometimes these are the things that cause conflicts between different religious groups, and paying too much attention to some of the more social aspects of morality, like you should dress in this particular way, or you should eat this particular way. You shouldn't drink coffee, or your dress needs to be a certain length, or your all of these different kinds of things. And it's interesting, we just read a passage in a letter from Swami Vivekananda's complete works, and he mentions a Mrs. Grundy, so we had to look up who Mrs. Grundy was. Well, Mrs. Grundy was a fictitious character in a play by Thomas Morton, who was particularly fastidious and narrow-minded in these kinds of things. So it became a common phrase about being Mrs. Grundy, or having a Grundyism about things. And so, being too particular about whether somebody drinks coffee or not, or something of that nature, is really not the the most fundamental idea of being moral. But oftentimes religions get into these things, and they identify themselves by these different things, by perhaps requiring a covering of the head or something of that nature. So, all right, let's continue.
This self cannot be gained by a man who is weak and cowardly. He must shake off all false ideas of weakness in time. He can never be weak. If he believes himself to be a part and parcel of the all-powerful God, how can the child of such a father be weak? He must have faith in his own boundless strength, which, although latent, may be displayed to its full advantage whenever the occasion demands it. If the struggle is continued in this way, victory will come within a very short time. The senses want one to make friends with all the beautiful women of the world. Morality commands, marry only one girl and love her. If you cannot resist lustfulness, for says St. Paul, it's better to marry than to burn. But if you can make yourself a eunuch for the kingdom of God, That is far better and nobler. The senses want a man to sacrifice truth for pleasure. Morality comes forward and commands him to sacrifice pleasure for truth and duty. The senses want him to live for the enjoyments of life. Morality commands him only to take as much enjoyments in the shape of food and drink as is necessary to keep his body and soul together. For fools alone live to eat, whereas the wise only eat to live. The senses want him to believe that all pleasures lie centered in them. Morality comes forward and says, no, the senses are the homes of misery, pain, and anguish. The abode of pleasure is beyond the senses. So spurn the senses, go beyond them, and you will find bliss perennial. March onward and never stop until you crush the senses under your feet. When perseverance, strength, and courage at last win the day, and when the senses are fully subdued, then begins to rise on the horizon of his mental plane the gladdening suns of truth and bliss, which are eternally and indissolubly connected with each other and shed their benign, congenial, balmy, and life-giving rays so as to plunge the victor into the ocean of breakless beatitude.
Yeah, so very stirring words that he's coming up with. And again, you can sort of take the attitude of a martial artist too. The martial artist uses the opponent's strength to their advantage. So if you hear something beautiful or see something beautiful or experience some a beautiful meal, somebody offers you a lovely meal and you're enjoying it, you can say, well, this is just the bliss of Brahman coming through in this particular way, and it's not going to last because it's coming through the veil of Maya. But the fact that anything is pleasurable or beautiful is the sattvic aspect of Maya, showing a little bit of that bliss of Brahman through. But we're not going to become attached to this temporary glimpse of the blissfulness. We'll simply let it pass on and then continue with what else we're going to do. So we're not going to let the senses trap us into anything, but if it presents us something that is lovely, then we say, oh, well, that's just the divinity showing through the veil of Maya a bit. Isn't that lovely for now? All right, let's continue.
When the senses are thus fully subdued, they in turn become the slaves of man, and instead of being foes, they become his most helping friends. Like his mind, his whole body becomes pure, and consequently only wants to associate itself with pure and holy things. The downward course of the senses is stopped. They all flow towards the attainment of truth and bliss. The eye, the ear, the nose, the tongue, and the entire body want to associate themselves with such people as have attained the truth. Mind and body act in harmony at the time, and there is an end of all quarrel between them once for all.
As you know, it is very helpful to be in the company of like-minded people. Our mental thoughts tend to sort of get into sync with the things that are around us and the people that are around us. And so I know that's sometimes very difficult in this more secular world. If you're in a workplace, oftentimes your coworkers aren't on the same spiritual path that you are, and they may not be on any spiritual path at all. And so that sometimes becomes difficult. Sometimes it seems like they go out of their way to show how worldly they are. But sometimes you're lucky enough to find at least some spiritually minded people that you can associate with, even if they're not on this exact same spiritual path. If they're a very good follower of another tradition, you find that their presence is also somewhat uplifting compared to some of the other people you might end up having to associate with. And so you have to get used to dealing with the people you have to deal with, but spend as much time as you can with people that are of like-minded interest, because there is sort of a sympathetic vibration that gets set up when you're in the presence of like-minded people. That's why it's said it's a great opportunity to able to meditate with a group of people that's meditating. Another thought occurred to me, just to give a contrast between two great Swamis. Swami Swahananda really had no particular interest in seeing beautiful scenery. Didn't do anything for him. But Swami Shraddhananda was somewhat of the opposite opinion. He could see Brahman everywhere. He saw it in the flowers and the trees and the grandeur of the rocks and so forth. And he just was constantly reminded of Brahman when he saw all these beautiful things of nature. So there you get a kind of two different sides of the situation. All right, let's continue here.
When the mind becomes free, it is at that time left to itself. Its former restlessness gives place to eternal calm, and in that calm and placid surface of mental ocean, the true image of the self, or God or truth, is reflected. The whole man is then filled with divinity. He's no longer a slave, but a master. Such a man is the real prop of a society. He alone is termed a great man. He is not a plaything of circumstances or senses. Rather, he turns all circumstances and all senses to his favor. Study the character of any great man here, and you will find that he was such a master. Posterity follows the example of such a great man, and thereby makes itself great. In the dark, meandering paths of this world, he serves as a beacon light to the weary travelers. Because he knows the truth, he becomes immortal, even as the truth itself. Common, ordinary men are being born and dying in large numbers. They're forgotten as soon as they're dead. With death, their life ends. But such is not the case with great men. They live even after their death. Millions and millions of men have passed away. Their names and homes have long been forgotten. But the sages, Buddha, Christ, Nanak, Chaitanya, Shankara, Ramanuja, Madhva, are still living in the world and are destined to live as long as the world lasts. They are the leaders of humanity. But for them, all human societies would have fallen to pieces. There would have been no peace, no law, no goodness. All human beings would have been so many beasts of the forest trying to kill one another, so that one might live upon the ruin of another, and the physically fittest alone could survive in the struggle for existence, and the world would be more like a forest and a desert than a pleasant dwelling house for all good people. Then man, caring only for sensual pleasures, blind to all other pursuits, forgetting his noble and holy and higher nature, being a mere plaything of the senses, would find no time to build a site for himself, to improve his condition in any way, and to raise himself higher than the actual beasts of the forest. Civilization would in that case be an unknown term here, and savagery and cannibalism would take its place. Oh, what a horrible picture is this! It actually would be the case if the senses were allowed to rule and not the soul.
Yeah, aren't there a couple of novels that deal with that sort of situation? Was it like Lord of the Flies is one that comes to mind, but I think there's some others too. I'm not that big of a literature person. I don't know if you can think of any. If anything pops in your mind, let us know. Now, this one sentence spoke of that idea of being like the Tai Chi master over your senses here. Let's see if I can find it. Yeah, he alone is termed a great man who is not a plaything of circumstances or senses, but rather he turns all circumstances and senses to his favor. So that's the key. You have to find a way to do that. All right, so let's continue here. Boy, these paragraphs go on forever. Talk about immortal, or almost immortal paragraphs.
Study history, and you will find that at the root of the downfall of every nation, there is immorality or sensuality. When in a nation the people, instead of serving God and truth, serve the senses, the downfall of that nation is near at hand. When luxury, lustfulness, impiety, and lawlessness go unpunished or overlooked, or are regarded as virtues, know that the doomsday of that nation is not far away. When a nation has no ideal to follow, when each individual is puffed up with vanity and thinks himself to be his own master, when religion and faith are pooh-poohed, and skepticism, the child of false reasoning, is highly extolled, honored, and followed, know the death warrant of that nation has already been issued. When Rome became immoral and sensual, when her ancient heroism gave place to theaters and Colosseum, when humanity, goodness, and charity were sacrificed at the altar of cruelty, debauchery, and savagery, when the halls of her conquering children were filled with the merry laughters of dancing girls, filling and distributing among them goblets of inebriating tonic, and to warlike and marital songs, loud and debasing melodies were preferred. The decline and fall of the Roman Empire was inevitable.
And of course, the difficulty is if you have a country that's under one particular religious tradition, then that religious tradition ends up having problems in controlling itself. It becomes overly interested in the politics and in controlling people and amassing wealth and dictating exactly what everyone's going to do. So that becomes a problem. But to have a country that has no religious background at all runs into the other problem of not having any kind of moral anchors in place. So really the trying to have a society that promotes religions of all kinds for different people of different faiths to follow, doesn't poo-poo any religion, but allows all the religions to flourish. That's really the best way to go. You don't want one religion controlling your government, and you don't want them all to just sort of fade away into the sunset. You want your religious traditions to be strong, but you don't want them to be dictating the whole thing and becoming corrupt themselves because they don't have anybody to counterbalance them. So that becomes one of the difficulties, and that's the kind of the difficulty the society is going through now, because when the whole society is not of your particular country isn't telling you you have to be in this particular religion, then people begin to lose their moorings. They just tend to kind of drift off, and they think, well, maybe religion really isn't that necessary, and it's nobody agrees, so there must be something wrong with it, and that sort of thing. All these doubts come into play. So really the message of Sri Ramakrishna and Vivekananda are really so important for this age, telling people how important religion is, and yet you don't have to be of any particular religion. There are many faiths you can follow that will lead you to the goal. And you don't need to argue with people that don't believe the way you do. In fact, you can enjoy their company because they're on a spiritual path. And that's really the way we have to get used to it. And it's difficult. People that are used to a one-shoe-fits-all approach struggle with this. They don't understand that a society doesn't have to restrict people to one religion, and that you don't have to legislate your religious ideas into the government system, that religions can do that themselves. All right, let's continue. This was another long paragraph, so I kind of interrupted us here. when France lost.
When France lost all faith in God, when a harlot was publicly worshipped and carried round the streets of Paris as the goddess of reason, when the people lost their common sense, then the bloody and horribly cruel revolution swept all over the country, plunging her into a sea of blood. All disasters, all downfalls are the outcome of immorality. Leisure is the cause of all progress. But can a slave ever expect to have any leisure? We have seen how a common man of the world is an abject slave to his senses, passions, and appetites, all of which have made him as restless as the wind. The restlessness of the human mind is therefore compared to a naturally restless monkey, made more restless by drink, by a wasp stinging at it, and by the possession of a ghost. It is only when the senses are brought under control that the man gets a little leisure. Then alone can he turn his mind to good account. It's very easy to let loose the reins and then allow the horses to run in whatever directions they choose. But it requires an effort, strength, dexterity, and skill to control them and guide them through proper paths. This shows that the man who can control his passions and turn them to good account is really a strong, skillful, and dexterous individual. Him we call a moral man. Morality consists in abstaining from all sensual pleasures. An abstinent and continent man is the highest type of a moral man. All great men of the world are abstinent and therefore moral men. They're the real masters of human societies, and not kings, emperors, and wealthy folks. The powers of these latter last only for a few days, whereas the influence of the former will be felt to the end of creation.
Yeah, and in this day and age, it's so easy to have access to so many things that it's even more important to be able to control the senses and how you use your time. You really have to think, all right, what is my long-term goal in this life? And is what I'm doing now and the way I'm spending my time actually getting me somewhere? Could it be better spent doing something else? So, the things that are available on TV, on podcasts, on music. Everyone's got a little earbud with music pounding into their ear day and night, and then you get addicted to little TikTok things and all these little things on the internet, and you open your computer to do some work, and they've got all these news things that they want you to click on, and then they want you to click on these little comic bits and so forth. And it goes on and on and on, and pretty soon you've spent an hour or two doing absolutely nothing that really contributes to your well-being or gets any of your work done. And so it's even more important today that we have some sort of self-control. It's much easier if you were Abraham Lincoln living in a log cabin and you had a few books to read and that was all you had to do. And of course, leisure is something which allows us to have time to do other things. If you go back centuries ago and you think how much time had to go into just surviving, getting the water to the crops, getting the crops to grow, harvesting the crops, grounding the wheat, on and on and on. The amount of time it would take to just even get a meal on the table just takes up your entire day. And so now we're extremely fortunate that we have so much free time and that so much is more convenient for us. We really have to make sure we're spending it in the right way and we're not constantly on some sort of social media platform. Now, all of these things can have a good side and a bad side, too. Obviously, you're watching us on YouTube, many of you. And so these platforms can do many good things, but they can also lead us off into the wild blue yonder and distract us from the things that we'd like to do. All right, let's read the next paragraph.
Study the character Sri Ramachandra. When his wicked mother wanted him to be banished from the kingdom for 14 years, he could easily withstand her will, occupy his legal throne, rule his territory, and enjoy all the good fruits thereof, but he abstained from doing all these things because he was not a man given to sensuality. He preferred truth to enjoyment, and he liked to see others happy much more than he wanted to enjoy that happiness himself. When the least of his subjects complained against the spotless character of the innocent, chaste, ever-beloved, and ever-loving Sita, dearer to him than anything else in the world, he immediately gave up her and banished her, although he had to rend his heart asunder to carry out such an extremely cruel act, altogether foreign to his sweet and loving nature, so that his subjects might be pleased thereby. To do good to others, even at the cost of one's own liberty and comfort, is the characteristic of a great man, and Sri Ramachandra was such a one. That is the reason why up to his death he was worshipped as God, and is destined to be so worshipped as long as the world lasts.
Of course, that's a very controversial subject about Rama and Sita and so forth, and there are different versions that have slightly different endings too. And I've heard people debate both sides of that issue endlessly. But we're not going to do that tonight. We're just going to see that, yes, if you take it in the way Swami Ramakrishnananda is taking it, you can see that this is being a virtuous act. You could argue other ways as well, but we're going to look at the good side here. All right, now we're going to go on to Yudhishthira. All right, let's see what he says about Yudhishthira.
Yudhishthira, the son of Dharma, is another example of such a model man. Duryodhana, the wicked son of the blind king Dhritarashtra, tried several times to put him and his brothers to death, to disinherit them by all sorts of filthy means, and spared no pains to insult, torture, and persecute them in as many satanic ways as he could invent. Yudhishthira bore them all silently, but instead of cursing him, he always looked upon him as his own dear cousin. Not that he could not punish him for all his ignominious and cruelty. If he had liked, he could have completely washed him off the page of existence. But he liked to see him happy and enjoy his life as an emperor more than he wanted to be an emperor himself. It was only when he saw that his mother, wife, and brothers had to suffer much on his account, he consented to declare war against the satanic prince and put him and his followers down altogether in the field of Kurukshetra.
All right, yeah, so these great epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, have many incidences which sometimes are puzzling and difficult to understand, but if you know the prevailing ideas of Dharma and what constituted right living in those days, you can understand where they're coming from. And of course, Swami Ramakrishnananda is coming from that viewpoint and sharing with us how these things illustrate great moral principles. And there are countless stories, and much of the morality of Hinduism is passed on through the recitation of these great epics. All right, let's read one more paragraph. I think we have time.
My dear friends, if you want to know what morality is, if you want to raise yourselves from the low level of a human brute to the highest plane of a God-man, if you want to be blessed with the enjoyment of real pleasure, if you want to save yourselves from the bondage of senses and passions, if you want to bask yourself under the benign rays of the sun of truth and bliss, if you want to be real benefactors of humanity, study the character of Sri Ramachandra and Sri Yudhishthira as depicted in the two of the greatest epics of the world, Ramayana and Mahabharata. Here in this connection, I cannot resist the temptation of quoting the million times quoted, universally known song of Longfellow to impress on your minds the necessity of such studies. Lives of great men all remind us we can make our lives sublime. and departing leave behind us footprints on the sands of time. Footprints that perhaps another, sailing over life's solemn main, a forlorn and shipwrecked brother seeing shall take heart again.
You know, it reminds me, my grandfather used to always quote from his elementary school readers, McGuffey's readers, and they had these little stories that had, you know, some sort of teaching to them. And so if some incident came up, he would come out and quote McGuffey's reader, and he'd even know which reader it was, McGuffey's third reader. He'd tell you a little story. I unfortunately was raised on Dick and Jane, which was the pablum of school readers. Absolutely pointless and useless stories. Probably the worst group of reading books for the elementary school one could imagine. But, you know, it's too bad that they didn't continue books that had some sort of point to them. The Jataka tales, of course, are also an interesting group of stories that children can enjoy, and they have meaning. They tell you some sort of principle to live your life on, some sort of morality to them. And of course, the Aesop's fables and so forth are other stories that have the same effect. All of these different stories allow you to get a glimpse of how various moral principles can be applied in our life and so forth. Well, we have just a little time, and that was actually the middle of a paragraph, so we'll just finish this paragraph and then we'll call it an evening. So we want to
So we see?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So we see that if we want to be moral ourselves, we must read and study the lives of all moral and great people. For by so doing, we shall always be in their company, and breathe the bracing atmosphere of purity and goodness, which is sure to fill us with noble energy, vigor, and aspiration. 'Tis the Spanish proverb, live with the dogs, and you will learn to howl. Whatever company we keep, our mind is sure to be molded according to that. Mind is like a reflecting glass that reflects whatever light it comes in contact with. So we should be particularly careful about the company we keep. Can then any company be better than those ideal characters whom I've just now mentioned for our edification?
You know, that's a good point, that when you're reading something or watching something on television or going to a movie, you're spending time with those people. And so those ideas are going to get permeated into your consciousness. And so the more you can watch uplifting things and things that show you the best ways to live life, the better off you are. Even fairy tales, you know, have morals to them and have hidden meanings in all the symbolism. And if you understand the symbolism of all these tales, then you can really get something out of them. And so it just reminds us to read the lives of spiritual saints and sages and their teachings, and to keep good company. All of those things help us to mold our lives in the best way. And you'll be doing it unconsciously eventually. It's not something you'll have to think about. It just becomes the norm for your life, because you've just sort of imbibed all of those ideas and principles that you've been reading about, and that you see that that's just the normal way people live. Whereas if you constantly watch people that are leading immoral lives, and you begin to think that's the norm, then you're going to be more tempted to not control your senses. So it's very good advice he's giving us. All right, we'll close with a chant and hope to see you next week. Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Vashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Filled with Brahman are the things we see. Filled with Brahman are the things we see not. From out of Brahman floweth all that is. from Brahman all, yet is it still the same. Om, peace, peace, peace.
Any comments?